Hello. Well, it's a real pleasure to talk today to Rohit Sood, Senior Partner at McKinsey, ahead of this panel discussion, which is called The Future of Operations, Productivity Meets People. Rohit, I understand you're joining us from Toronto, and I'm based here in London. People are watching us, I hope, from around the world. So I guess this feels like the future of operations in action. We're able to talk to each other and attempt to solve problems, even though we're miles apart and connected only by this fragile spider's web of technology. So I wonder if you could start by explaining to us what you see as the future of operations, and if you could just put it into a historical perspective. How significant are the changes that we are living through right now?
Well, thank you, Henry, for having me today for this, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. And it has been close to our hearts, and a very passionate discussion on this is going on in the industries that I cover. Today, we'll be talking mainly about service industries, so you can imagine banking, insurance, telecom, retail, healthcare, etc. So anything to do with service experience for the customers and how this is impacted. Look, I think I'll start by saying for McKinsey and for a lot of our clients, what we are seeing and talking about is nothing short of an industrial revolution in services industries. Like we all have been students of history, and we know that the big industrial revolution happened in manufacturing and production way back, almost a century or more back. And it was a factor of five, six things coming together. Of course, there was the steam engine, there was the chemical manufacturing, there was machine tooling, etc., which all brought together this very deep and structural way that production moved from man to machine, and it became irreversible. What we are seeing today is in service industries, four or five trends that we will talk about today, and I'll talk with my panelists about, is coming together of these four or five trends where we believe the tipping point on these trends has been arrived. And therefore, we think that what we are seeing in 2020, 2021, and for several years to come will be nothing short of what generations after us will look back and say this was the turning point of how services are created and delivered.
Can you just explain to me, so what are these trends that you see, and maybe you could help us perhaps understand them by putting them in the context of a specific industry. Let's just say an industry close to my heart, retailing. Could you sort of, in a sense, elaborate on your different trends using that lens, the retail lens?
For sure, Henry. And look, there are four trends that we will be covering today, and the impact on this is significant. And retail is one of the sectors that is seeing a lot of it. I think the first one is we'll talk about the hybridization of the workforce. So basically, of course, we all have been used to, physical footprints, people coming into offices Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 jobs. And in March, what we saw was something very phenomenal. Like overnight, all the workforce, and these are people operating out of 5,000 strong operating centers, 10,000 strong operating centers, of course, in retail sector as well, they immediately went virtual. And at the beginning of it, everybody was scared as hell because nothing like this had been done in a matter of a week and two. But surprisingly, the infrastructure held up, the processes held up by and large. Customer experience for some parts deteriorated but came back again, etc. So that has been a big shift to say, how do you really think about a workforce which doesn't need to be on their desks, as we used to call it, the fingers on the type boards throughout in a physical setting. And what we see now is a trend which is as COVID is almost behind us, hopefully, and the vaccine is taking hold, a lot of these institutions starting to debate what is the future of workforce from a physical standpoint. And a lot of the surveys that the institutions have done has come back shockingly high in terms of how many workers want to either retain the flexibility of completely working from home forever or working in a hybrid model where they spend 2 to 3 days in a physical footprint and the remaining days at working out of their home and the flexibility that affords them. What therefore we are calling the first trend as hybridization of the workforce is pretty predominant. And retail is one of those sectors where, yes, there will be some physical presence in the stores, but a lot of the operations roles, a lot of the customer care roles, a lot of the servicing roles, institutions are evaluating a strong shift towards hybridization. But having said that, I think, look, for each of these trends, I'll also mention whether we believe that there's a tipping point that has come or not yet. For hybridization of workforce, in McKinsey and talking to our clients, we do believe that the tipping point has arrived, right? And the world post COVID, in terms of the physical footprint, will look very different from the past. Now, there are few factors to think about in hybridization of the workforce. The number one factor is, how do you really think about talent development, retention, promotion? Because now, if a significant portion of your workforce is virtual, how do you really develop the management practices to be able to onboard them, train them, curate them, promote them? I think the second very big factor is, how does it really help your or counter your culture? Will it harvest away the DNA of your culture, or will it there be an opportunity to further strengthen your culture? Because earlier culture used to be considered within the four walls of a physical setting. You're able to interact with your peers and your mentors and coaches. So that used to be the way the culture used to be promoted. I think the third big factor will be, right now, the suddenness of moving everybody to virtual masked a lot of issues around operations and cyber resiliency. What organizations, if they have to move to hybrid models, have to put real careful thought about future processes. And are they robust enough? Are they simple enough to be able to stand the test of cyber resilience and even operations resilience, right? I think the last point is, we all, even in service industries, grew up in the world called Toyota Production Systems. This is about a set of management tools and mechanisms that you have to be in person with each other to be able to oversee work, to be able to design new ways of problem solving, etc. So I think this will push the limits of what is the future of management systems and how do you drive the same level of performance, right? Having said that, look, the other angle to balance is the mental health, right? It's not easy to be motivated. As we've all seen, our workforce is struggling. And if it goes into a permanent hybridization mode, how do you keep the mental well being of your workforce, right? So, what I mentioned is like five, six factors, Henry, that will come together to determine whether this trend will continue to move forward in a much more systematic way, or will there be some breakage and going back to the former?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've been looking recently at the retail sector, and you look at, for example, the way that e-commerce has accelerated during the pandemic, and one gets this, quickly comes to the conclusion that actually a lot of commerce is going to go online and will stay there inevitably. But the word hybridization that you use is a word that I'm also coming across time and time again in the retail sector, in the sense that it's not just digitalized. The store will be there, the office will be here, and people will have to cope with, in a sense, different channels. So, can you just perhaps talk about how executives should think about where to draw the line between the physical and the digital, to avoid some of those problems that you mentioned, like workforce, mental health in the workforce, and even creativity?
Excellent question, Henry. And actually, that provokes me to get into the second big trend that we are seeing, which is contactlessness of customer experience, right? So if you think about hybridization as you have 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 rich operating centers from the past, the more of the back office and middle office, that's where the hybridization is a big impact around, will they remain completely virtual or they get physical? For something like retail, and that also covers a lot of these sectors, and where physical experience is important. Retail is a big example you mentioned. Travel is another one. Entertainment is another one. Healthcare is another big one too. For example, uh, the notion of contactless is here to stay, and I will touch on it a little bit, but I'll also invoke one of my panelists, Linda Avery, who is a leader from Verizon, and they have been reinventing their whole contactless experience model for their retail stores and their field services. But the basic thing is, look, if you think about contactless, there are 4 or 5 things you have to take into consideration. One is which set of experiences were transactional in nature, where you really don't need to experience the product and can or service and can actually be simply moved to digital without impacting the customer experience. I think that is very important part. I think there's a second portion of it, which is in some cases the flow of a customer through the process is inevitable. Imagine checking into a hotel and getting to your room and enjoying the facilities in a hotel. You still have to flow as a body through the system. I think in those ones, what I've seen progressive institutions do a very deep zero-based designing from the moment you book yourself into a hotel to the moment you walk into the door to the moment you get to the room, map out each and every interaction from 3 dimensions: customer to customer engagement, customer to employee to employee engagement, and then take a step back to say, look, from a frequency of interaction, from the duration of interaction, and from the extent of interaction, what is the risk we are posing if it is contact based, right? And then trying to come up with more of the digital solutions which integrate into your physical journey and make it seamless, right?
Mm.
So, for example, a lot of the border security forces are right now reinventing their whole model where you get off from the plane and get into your car without having to interact with single body at the airport end to end. Now, that is the next horizon of contactless, right? And then the last point I'll mention, Henry, is in all of these sectors, it is the seamless omni-channel integration that is very key for these experiences. For example, you cannot have portions of the experience which are contactless and through some digital enablement. Some of the other experiences are transactional and fully digital or virtual or AI enabled. They have to be very integrated with each other so that when you're flowing through the system, you might be shifting seamlessly through a digital integration enablement or app, through a AI interaction, through a simple, flowing through a person but not really interacting with them like in a service setting. But I think this omni-channel interaction will play a big part. Look, Linda will touch upon this notion of how have they reinvented their whole store experience without you having to even walk into a store for a retail purchase or a servicing.
Mm.
And that has been a big part of Verizon's value proposition to the customers. But in my
Let
mind,
me,
this contactless. Sorry, go ahead, Henry.
yeah, let me ask you. Let me just ask you about that because it's a very interesting uh, challenge, I guess, for the companies in the sense that if the transactions are all being done digitally through AI or whatever, customer service obviously becomes so much more important. And yet, I believe that what we're increasingly seeing is this sort of uh, I think you've called it the Uberization of the workforce, but others call it the gig economy. How do you get those workers who are not necessarily employees of the firm to engage with the firm in such a way that they offer that fantastic customer service, which is really what's going to be important to keep the customer happy?
Excellent point, Henry. In fact, Uberization is one of the 4 trends in my mind, which has not yet reached a tipping point, which will take some time. Look, I think, yes, from a supply side of Uberization, the gig economy, 40% of the workers want to be in some kind of a gig economy. That has increased. However, having said that, Uberization is one trend that, in order to preserve your customer experience, will take a lot of time for you to be able to understand which portions, the very select portions of your workforce you actually Uberize and source from external sources and platforms. I think, yes, to your, I would predict that a lot of institutions will want to preserve a lot of these experiences on permanent workforce that they can continue to curate the talent and customer experience based on. But Uberization will be very instrumental for some rare talent like analytics, engineering, development, IT, etc., where you might not need direct customer experience, but you will still be able to source talent at much cheaper and much better sources, I would say geographically as well, from Uberization. So the mandate on Uberization is still out.
Right. Rohit, there is a tremendous amount to continue to discuss on this, and it's fantastic that you are about to engage in a panel with many more aspects of what you've laid out here in this brief conversation with me. Anyway, thanks very much. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear what you have to say, and look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Henry, and I look forward to it. And I'll be joined by Andy Eichfeld from Discover and Linda Avery from Verizon as we get into these discussions. But I must say, conclude by saying we live in very interesting times, and this time is very pivotal for the future for several decades to come.
How fascinating. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, welcome everyone again for continuing the discussion that I was just having with Henry. And we were talking about some significant trends we are all seeing in the service industries and whether that all comes together to herald what we are calling the industrial revolution for services. I'm now joined by two of the panel members, Linda Avery and Andy Eichwell. I'll let them do justice to their introductions, and then we'll get into the thick of the conversation. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Rui, and I'm super excited to be here. This is such an incredibly interesting topic. So I am the Chief Data and Analytics Officer for Verizon. I am their first Chief Data and Analytics Officer. And this is actually for me a big move because I spent my career up to this point in the financial services industry. So I was at Goldman Sachs for 20 years. I was a managing director in technology. I then became the first Chief Data Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And I just joined Verizon a year ago in September. So new industry, new opportunities, really exciting time to be in telecommunications.
Thank you, Linda. Andy.
Thanks, Rohit, and welcome, Linda. I'm Andy Eichfeld. I'm the Chief Human Resources and Chief Administration Officer at Discover Financial Services. For those that may not be as familiar with Discover, we are a credit card issuer as well as a digital bank with lending and deposit products in the U.S. We also run a payments network globally, so similar to Visa and MasterCard, though not as large. So that's what we do. We're a digital player and a remote player since we started 35 years ago. I've been here for 2 years and a few months. Prior to that, I was with McKinsey & Company for 23 years. One of the responsibilities I have at Discover is for what we call the Discover Management System, which is our lean-based management system. And that's something I spent a lot of time with at McKinsey, helping clients install lean-based management systems. So the kind of questions we're talking about today around the nature of work and different models for organizing work and people that do work, I'll be drawing on all of that experience as I share my views today.
Excellent. Thank you. And welcome again, Linda and Andy. Look, I'm super excited to have this conversation with both of you because between you, you both represent some of our service industries that have seen enormous amount of changes. And to some extent, even I can brave the word disruptions in the last 12 months. And, it'll continue to see a lot of disruptions going forward. Now, to take a step back, look, Henry and I talked about this is once in decades or once in a century event, the amount of changes we are seeing driven by COVID and post-COVID, what will come out of it. We coined this almost equal to an industrial revolution, but for services industries at large, right? Regardless of whichever industry we talk about. I wanted to throw it open to your reactions to say, is it equal to something significant like an industrial revolution in services? Would you characterize some of the changes and shifts we'll talk about as deep and structural and irreversible? So over to you. Maybe we'll start with you, Linda.
Absolutely. I mean, the question of industrial revolution is a really interesting one. And if you look at, what's been happening, in order to remain competitive, we've all had to operate with a laser focus on continuously changing the way we work. So this notion of changing how we work is nothing new. But I think that what, is episodic here is that there's a foundational change to how human beings are behaving and how we work coming through COVID. people by nature seek stability. They don't want to make change. And so it really takes significant events to jolt us out of inertia and really drive us to adopt innovation. And I have to say that this pandemic has definitely been this kind of a jolt. When I think about the trend of rapid and extreme digitization, I think about, just looking at what happened within Verizon's network usage alone, is a hugely interesting story. And I've got a gazillion statistics I could share with you. I'm going to resist that. But I do have to share one. We saw a 12,000% increase in the use of collaboration tools in the first 90 days of COVID responses. So we saw this happening with tens of millions of people who suddenly started to work from home and learn from home in the course of just a few weeks. And that's pretty extreme in terms of rapid digitization. I also just want to do a brief call out to our Verizon team for, in the midst of these unprecedented volumes and shift in usage, somehow or another, we managed to keep a high quality service at a time where people needed our network more than ever. But in my mind, if I think about what the pandemic has wrought in terms of, what I'm seeing in terms of a massive change in how people are behaving, this is absolutely, to me, a revolution.
Thank you. Andy, what do you think?
I think it's an acceleration of digitization and contactless, a significant acceleration for many services industries. And, revolution, I might not go all the way there with you, but certainly acceleration. The questions around hybrid and democratization, this is remote work. And what has changed with COVID is so many people have experienced remote work, managing remote work out of necessity. And it's impossible to put that back in the box. So companies are going to need to have a stance on remote work post-COVID within the next few months, because post-COVID will eventually come later this year, I believe. So that is urgent, acceleration and urgent to have a stance to tell our workers what we expect of them and what they can expect of us. To me, that's the biggest acceleration. Uberization, I will probably have a spirited conversation about that one later on. Yes, the marketplace for contracting is evolving, it's getting more efficient, but I'm skeptical that the gig model is going to be the dominant model for most service companies. And I'll throw that out there for us to come back to later.
Excellent. We have all the material for a great debate. So let's just jump in. Look, Henry and I talked about 3 or 4 different trends which are coming together to make this, the perfect storm. The first trend that we touched upon is something called hybridization of workforce. So thinking about, the workforce being, when they return to the new normal, being either fully virtual or partially virtual, with only a small portion being the good old days of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. I wanted to turn it over to you guys. You have huge amounts of workforce that has been working from home right now, but looking forward, what's the nature of setting it up in the future that you envision? And again, let's get going on that.
Well,
so Linda, sorry.
I'm happy to answer that question. So, frankly, if you look at the work from home, remote work, hybrid workforce, the genie is out of the bottle, and it's not going back. I think that, this arrangement has turned out to be better than just about any of us expected to be. I'm going to actually reference a quote, and it's just the spirit of the quote, of something that I heard James Gorman, actually the CEO of Morgan Stanley, say on the topic. What he said was essentially that if he had been told a few months back that 90% of his employees would be working from home and the firm would be functioning fine, he would basically say, no way am I prepared to take that risk, because the downside of that, being wrong there was massive. But we didn't have a choice here. And, today, if you were to look at statistics, about 50% of work services are right now being provided from home. And over the course of 6 months, we've seen, interestingly enough, alongside that, about 60 million hours of commuting hours have been reallocated, and they've gone actually predominantly into the workday. So there's, these are things that people are trying to work through as they make this shift. But, what's interesting here with what's happened is that things like the notion of the main office, that's kind of dissipated for now. We all sit at the same virtual table. And we can call it democratization of the workforce. People can work from anywhere, though I don't agree with they can work at any time yet. I'm not sure if the 9 to 5 has really shifted that much, but I think that there's a tremendous upside to all this. Certainly access to talent is a big upside. But on the other hand, I think that, things that we need to be worrying about by the same token with this massive shift is, notions of culture and the building of relationships. I keep thinking back to, just the last decade where there's been such a major focus on office space design and trying to maximize how people work and open workspaces and trying to design for the moment. And over the last few months, it's been every person for themselves in terms of, how we could rig up our space, how we could rig up, some notion of privacy, which doesn't always work, what kind of connectivity we could have. But what's also been lost are is happenstance, the casual connections that build relationships, the notion of being together, bearing witness together in a room that could constitute culture. So, this is frankly a grand social experiment. There's a ton that has to be figured out here, but I don't think that we're moving back to the way things were ever.
Got it.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. Yeah, we had similar comments, particularly back in April. Discover's experience was to move all employees to work from home in 3 weeks. It was a massive mobilization evacuation, and I think everybody who was sort of involved in the middle of that will remember it the rest of their lives. And our employees were enormously grateful, and our customers were grateful that we were there for them with very little disruption. And we never would have chosen to do that. We did it out of hierarchy of need, safety first. So we have reminded ourselves that we should be more willing to experiment in the future before we say no or draw conclusions. That said, as we've been reflecting on questions around remote and hybrid, we've been reminding ourselves not to make cognitive leaps, not to make false leaps in logic. And some of the things that we're questioning are, is this work from home, or is this trying to work during a crisis from home? And the reason I separate those is a lot of people are rallying and they're putting on a strong face, but they may be masking other challenges that are under the surface for them in this heavily remote model. That may be tied to the work model. It may be tied to what's happening in their households and families. It's hard to take those apart. As we've surveyed employees several times over the last 10 months, their preferences, their stated preferences do move. They're not that predictable, whether they're single and at home alone or have young kids, old kids. It's moving. And so we've learned that preferences have shifted. There's a lot more openness and desire for flexibility, but not everybody, has a stated preference to go all the way there, and it does move. One of the things that we ask ourselves is which part of the company are we talking about? So for context, we've got about 17,500 employees and 5,000 contractors. Rough numbers, 9,000 customer service agents who historically either worked from home or worked from a service center in the US. We've got about 4,000 technologists who engineers and others who work on apps, cybersecurity, et cetera. about 1,000 analysts who do advanced analytics, and then marketers, HR, finance, etc. It's very different work. I think the transition has been most successful with the customer service staff. It's easy to measure their performance from the customer back, and they're performing comparable or better in almost every way to prior to the evacuation. But one of the questions we joke about is, why do people believe that the white collar functions in our are more productive than they were before? We didn't actually know how to measure it before. Why do we believe we can measure it now? And I think a lot of people are confusing inputs for outputs. Our commuting times are down, so we're more present or more frequently at work. But is that the same as productivity? No. One more I'll share, and then I'll pass it back to Linda. We think about creativity and innovation. We have hundreds of agile teams. They're tied into products. They're tied into advanced analytics teams. We until 10 months ago, we believed strongly in creating co-location and structured interaction for innovation and coordination to happen in a fast way. All of that work is being done remotely. We were fortunate that a lot of our visualization tools were already digital and they ported immediately. But our pace of innovation, we really question if it's kept up. We really question if we know how to have a high pace of innovation in a fully remote way, or in an increasingly hybrid way with different permutations of who's remote every day. And so we're going to think really hard about what are the conditions for innovation that we're going to create, and what are the expectations for those employees involved in that work going forward. We don't know the answers yet, but we do spend a lot more time thinking about the fundamentals of these questions than we did in the past.
Yeah. And I think this whole notion is very obvious in customer service operations and back office operations. I wanted to talk about another trend, which is in processes where you still need engagement with the customers, right? And there's a plethora of examples that Henry and I talked yesterday: healthcare and travel and entertainment. And I wanted to touch it on the context of Verizon now, Linda. Is you have a massive
Absolutely.
field services setting, right? And you have so many retail stores. So how has contactless evolved? Do you think that's also reaching a tipping point of its own now?
Well, we've had to innovate massively. So on the topic of innovation, in order to protect our customers, in order to protect our field technicians and our folks out in retail, we had to make some pretty rapid, substantial changes in order to continue to support our customer base. And, it's funny when we think about, this drive towards being contactless. We were talking before about a hybrid workforce. We're actually in some ways talking about a tribrid workforce where the third entity of the table is actually automation. And so I think that's really kind of where we're going much more. I mean, just to touch on a couple of the innovations that, we had to undertake. We came out with, let's say, Fios in a box. So the demand for our Fios products soared, as you can imagine. And yet here we had field technicians that didn't want to go into people's homes, and our customers did not want them in homes. So we had to come out with a capability that allowed our customers to self-install Fios. We came out with a product for our field technicians called Tech-C. And this one's really interesting. This is where, if a customer is experiencing some technical issues, they can actually click on a link. And now our field technician has a camera still outside the house and is able to work with the customer in terms of diagnosing and resolving the issues. So, I think that, coming out of this, I don't necessarily recommend this type of situation as a way to drive innovation, but Lord knows, I think a lot of companies have had to do that. But with the case with these innovations here, I think about, going contactless, and there's certainly been a drive in the retail space to do this as well. You have kind of the hybrid situation that we have today where, we have the ability to, basically, walk into a store having pre-vetted what you're looking for. You could have the product delivered to your car. But I think if you look at, contactless retail, I mean, Amazon is at the peak of that. And so if you look at that experience, however, it's fantastic from a transaction perspective. It's a good transactional experience. But, as we become more and more digital, how are we going to differentiate ourselves in how we delight our customers? So we're getting into, again, that there's the softer angle of the human experience, just like I talked about culture before in the hybrid workforce. How do we retain the ability to delight our customers in our transactions in this experience? Salespeople used to do that. Salespeople used to get to know their customers. Somebody would walk in and they could even tell the mood of somebody walking through the door. As the chief data and analytics officer, I'm looking to build models that can replace the salesperson to kind of elevate the experience of shopping. But there's another angle to this. I go back to when I was growing up and how, retail was a magical experience. Yes, malls were at one point a place of wonder. You think about going to Macy's or FAO Schwartz, or the magic that the windows on Fifth Avenue could create around the holidays. How do we recreate that kind of magic in this contactless world that we seem to be moving towards? How do we differentiate ourselves, moving beyond just safety and efficiency? So this gets to be very interesting, particularly with the big focus, of course, of emerging regulations on privacy, and ensuring that we're using data in ways that can be trusted by our customers.
Yeah. Andy, any quick words on contactless before I move us into the third trend?
I'm in awe of what companies like Verizon and many others who have to have physical delivery of service at home, in a hospital, in an essential retail environment. Just the dynamics of that, and I think the innovation around reducing touch and improving safety, will lead to big changes in the design of the retail or in-person experience and all the things that go around it. For Discover, we haven't had to struggle with that, because we are a financial product. We're all remote. Certainly we're issuing contactless cards like everybody else in the world, and that's accelerated because of the safety factor. But that's about the extent of contactless, for us here.
Very well. Excellent. So look, I'll move the discussion into perhaps the last trend we'll talk about, which I know both of you are very passionate about. It's around Uberization and democratization of talent, which basically, as I was talking to Henry, means they're platforms for enabling contract working, given the gig economy. There's also a trend around you don't need to source talent only from your current operating centers. You can go pan-America or even more global to source the best talent, perhaps at a cheaper rate and perhaps with better retention, etc. So let's see, whether you think this will reach a tipping point. You think this trend will also be as irreversible as the first two we talked about. So maybe we'll start perhaps with you, Andy, this time.
Let me start with the more straightforward one in my mind, which is I'll call it talent sourcing. So yes, there's buzz around. Maybe we can go find great talent outside of our traditional footprint for sourcing talent. And we need to look at that seriously. But it comes down to which talent segment and profile are we talking about? And then why is it that we're not able to get as much of the caliber that we need in our footprint? Are there other ways that we can play the game better, improve our game before we jump to sourcing nationally or globally. And I think we will source some profiles nationally, but not that many and not that much volume. I'll give you something we look at is there's about 10,000 engineers available each year in Chicagoland, where our headquarters is and most of our technology teams are. We need a few hundred of them every year. So, as a digital bank established in the industry, can we win a few hundred of the best engineers in Chicagoland? And what is the delta between that and the best engineers that we could go fight for everywhere else? And so, that's something we're looking at right now. The other thing that we're thinking hard about is we expect that a lot more of our customer service agents will work from home in the future. And not that we didn't do it before, but much bigger numbers. Should we source those agents outside of our footprint, or should we keep what we call a tether between our physical locations and where we're sourcing? And there's some option value in keeping a tether, at least for a while. And there's some simplification in keeping a tether for a while. So it really comes down to, in those particular talent markets, for those segments and those geographies, can we win what we need before we jump to going further afield? And again, that's how we're looking at the democratization question, if you will. Maybe I'll pause there and see if Linda has other thoughts or maybe challenges to that.
Well, I mean, I think just generally, I see Uberization as having some real limits. I mean, this is certainly a topic that when I was at the Federal Reserve, we were looking at this topic very, very seriously. And, if you step back, in some ways it's extremely attractive. I mean, there's a way of meeting capacity search needs, talent search needs. And for a lot of people, I think that, being able to work flexibly on a job-by-job basis and then take off on a trip to Thailand to ride a bicycle and then come back and work again is kind of seen as the ultimate in employment, and it provides a lot of freedom. But, if you think about what's happening with Uberization, what we're doing here is that we're actually normalizing people's jobs to the point where people become interchangeable as individuals to a large extent. And to me, if you think about that normalization, it's actually potentially a precursor to automation. To me, things that could be so normalized that you could just drop any number of people into it is something that in many cases has the potential ultimately to be automated. So I just kind of want to call that out. As that continues to happen, the individuals are losing a lot of negotiating power. So what you start seeing happen is kind of an imbalance. Part-time workers do not have the same benefits as full-time workers. This is going to become more and more of a challenge. And so what you've got there is you got freedom, but you don't have job security, you don't have benefits, you don't have the peace of mind. And so you can also see that, from a large company perspective, there's upside here because of worker instability gives them a better bargaining position. And so, what I would expect to see if that imbalance becomes, profound, we're going to start seeing unions arising again. And maybe unions are going to start representing those engineers and those, application developers, because they're not in a position to effectively fend for themselves. But, ultimately, I guess I'm going to say one more thing on this. We are basically tribal by nature. And this notion that we're just going to operate as independent free agents, with no strong connectivity, to the organizations that we support, I don't think that's a natural state of being for human beings. And so just in summary, I find Uberization as something that is interesting. It has relevance, but I think it's also we're going to see it has limits as to how far it goes.
Thank you, Linda. One last comment each. I'll invite both of you. Any one piece of advice to your peers on a call to action in 2021 as they think about the future of operations? So, Andy, over to you.
Well, I would love my competitors to talk about Uberizing their workforce a lot, like scream it, because it's going to help us. I agree with Linda completely. I want them to have the operational and reputation risk that comes with going big on Uberizing. It'll make it easier for us to differentiate on service, and it'll make it easier for us to source talent where we want to source it. Because I think a big chunk of the talent market, like Linda said, wants to belong, wants to be part of something physically, and not all, but a big chunk. So willing to place the bet there. Stepping back, again, I think companies have to have a stance on hybrid, the hybrid topic soon. They have to be able to tell their workforce what to expect post-COVID. I think that's the most urgent thing to develop a stance on. And then certainly all the other challenges that come with how you want to compete. If you want to Uberize or not, please do. If you're a financial institution, we'll appreciate it. But all of those are important, but maybe not as urgent today.
Excellent. Well, this can keep going on, and I'm having a fabulous time. I'm sure our viewers are also. But I wanted to thank you all both for a terrific conversation on these, and all the very best, all the very health in 2021 to both of you and families.